Hey everyone, Luke Inc. here again. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about making fantasy drawings a little bit more interesting. Fantasy is a huge genre. It encompasses a lot of different topics. And we tend to fall into the same tropes when we illustrate fantasy. I know I definitely do. And don't get me wrong, the tropes are my favorite thing. I'm a huge fan of classic fantasy, sword and sorcery, and I definitely like illustrating those tropes: dragons, wizards, castles, forests, creatures of all kinds. And there are a few different techniques that I use to kind of put a little twist on those tropes and make my drawings maybe a little bit better than they otherwise would be. So I wanted to share those things with you today and hopefully allow you to get some fresh perspective on those tropes and make your drawings, your fantasy drawings, just a little bit more interesting. So here's my top 5 ways to make fantasy drawings more interesting. All right, since I started off this video talking about tropes, I thought I would share this drawing as an example of how I love tropes. There's nothing wrong with drawing the familiar. And this one is a classic example. It's got the fairy tale castle, the dragon. It's even got the twisty vines with thorns on them. You can't get much more classic fantasy or fairy tale than this drawing. And I like it. It's one of my favorites. But let's dive into the 5 ways that you can make your drawings just a little bit more interesting. Number 1 on my list is make your characters interesting. And the way we do that is by taking something that would normally be somewhat familiar and adding some features or characteristics to that character that maybe people haven't seen before or they haven't seen that combination before. So take something that has wings, give it horns, give it interesting weapons, that type of thing. Another thing we can do is anthropomorphize animals. These 2 armadillos are a great example. This was an Inktober prompt from last year, and I thought, why not take armadillos and make them the main characters, make them into little warriors, and it turned out great. It took a drawing that would otherwise be okay, but not really very interesting if this was humans, and it made it a lot more unique and a lot more interesting. So this one has some unique armor, different helmet shape, and I came up with this just by sort of doodling around. And I just liked that shape of a helmet. I thought it was really unique and different. Hadn't seen anything like that before exactly. And it really makes this drawing stand out as an interesting design. And here we have something else, something that you could call a fairy, I suppose, that has the traditional wings, but also has a helmet with these kind of horn-like antennas on it. And again, it's taking something familiar, putting a little spin on it, making it just a little bit more interesting. Second on my list is create unique fantasy creatures. Now this is very close to number 1, obviously. You've got characters versus creatures. We tend to see things through the perspective of a character a little more. They tend to be more human or human-like. Creatures tend to be just a little bit more alien than a character and things that we can't really relate to as well. And so the idea with creating a really cool fantasy creature is taking characteristics of more than one thing and blending them together, kind of mashing them up into your own chimera. And while this is an interesting creature, this is something that's been done before, but I give it my own little spin. I add some more hair to it, make it look a little more creepy. And it's all about just looking to nature for inspiration. And as I've talked about before, look no further than the insect world for absolutely horrific things. And they're a great source of inspiration for creatures, as well as taking a dragon and putting your own spin on it. This is kind of dragon-like, but also a little dog-like. And as you can see, I've added lots of different kinds of horns and scales, blended in some fur. And then you've got other classic creatures tentacles coming out of the ground. Not original in itself, but I've added a couple other little features that maybe make it a little more unique. So it's all about that interesting combination, just in the same way that creating interesting characters is about putting in combinations of things that you normally haven't seen before or normally wouldn't see. Creatures is very much the same way, but taking on more animalistic characteristics and blending those in to make a really unique creature. Number 3 on my list is play with the scale of the objects in your drawing to give it a truly fantastical feel. Take something that is normally small and make it gigantic, or the reverse. Take something that's normally big and make it tiny. And you can bring humans or bring familiar elements into that drawing to as a reference point to show the scale. So in this case, we've got this little human figure riding a snail in this kind of forest of mushrooms. Now, we don't know if the human is tiny or everything else is gigantic, but it really doesn't matter. The important part is that the relative scale is truly reversed, and this human is all of a sudden in this realm that is normally very small. So it brings that sense of fantasy to it automatically. Again, something that's normally small, make it gigantic. Giant snake. And a sense of scale can also be brought in with landscape a little bit, making your figures, your human figures, tiny, and these great beasts that they're riding in this larger landscape can really give it a feeling of fantasy. And a couple more examples of using a human proportionally to show that dramatic scale shift is having somebody ride something, a bat, something that's normally small, and putting a human on it brings that element of fantasy. And even better if you can do it with something that you normally wouldn't see, like a seahorse. So that's number 3, is play with the sense of scale to really kind of turn things on their head and make it immediately fantastical. Number 4 on my list is landscapes. So you can introduce fantastical elements into a landscape to really give it that otherworldly feel. And obviously this piece has some other elements going on as well that more obviously make it fantasy, but the landscape is also a key feature in this particular piece. And without that, the drawing would definitely not be as interesting. Here's another example of using environment to impart a sense of fantasy. Obviously, again, there's other elements that make it fantastical, but this ink wash technique that I've used gives it a very menacing, otherworldly feel. And another piece with ink wash does a similar thing in a different way. These little blots of ink that I've allowed to feather out have really given this a completely different tone than it would have if this warrior was just standing on a flat surface. Introducing more than one moon in the sky. This piece would be almost more historic if it weren't for these 2 moons in the sky that give it a little bit of a fantasy feel to it. And introducing landscapes that are just based on real landscapes that we have, but maybe just taking it and stretching it a little bit, pushing it a little bit to give it that fantastic feel. And introducing small elements that really just add to something that you already know is fantasy. This is obviously fantasy with the trope of the wizard and the unicorn and the tentacles, but I've got these larger than life mushrooms down here, which just add to it and give it even more of a fantasy vibe. Number 5 on my list is give things a fantastic association. So you take something out of its element, put it in a different element, or you take 2 characters or other elements and associate them in ways that they normally wouldn't be together in an image. So ships sailing through the air is a great example. Another thing that I've done, this is a little more subtle, is, obviously it's very fantastical, but you notice that he's got these other little fish that are on leashes, something that you normally don't associate with something that's underwater. And just adding those little things that give it just that extra sense of otherworldliness and being out of place really adds a lot of fantasy to it. And then there's other, just more basic ways of doing it, such as this dragon that I recently drew. I was thinking that you normally don't see dragons that are in sort of cactusy environments. We usually draw them in forests or in sandy deserts. Normally don't see them with like saguaro cactus. And so this association, these two elements that you don't normally see together, kind of add and give it just a little more interest than it would otherwise have if it was in a more traditional setting. So there you go, 5 ways to add some interest to your fantasy drawings. I've got 2 more ways that I do that. I saved the best for last, and I've got an exclusive video over on my Patreon. There's a link below, and I'll go into a little more depth into how to take your fantasy drawing that little bit extra and make it as good as you can. So check that out, and I've got a whole lot of other exclusive content over there for you to check out as well. But thank you for watching this video to the end. I appreciate all of your likes and shares and subscribes. Hope you have a great day. Happy drawing.